So glad you're here. I'm Julie Ballou. Thank you for joining me for Rape the Podcast. I dived into a pamphlet I found put out by Missouri Attorney General Eric Smith titled Crime Victims' Rights, Understanding the Criminal Justice System. Victims of crime are guaranteed certain notification rights and participation in the criminal justice system under an amendment to the Missouri Constitution and laws that took effect in 1993. The rights in this publication automatically apply to victims of dangerous felony crimes, which may include arson, assault, kidnapping, manslaughter, murder, rape, robbery, sodomy, or an attempt to commit one of these crimes. It starts with victims' notification rights concerning victims' access to information. It lists agencies such as law enforcement, prosecutors, custodial authorities, that's the people who have custody of the defendant or perpetrator, the Board of Probation and Parole, and the Attorney General's office itself. Case status is a prevalent right in each of these agencies. It also includes the availability of victim services, including compensation, financial assistance, and emergency crisis intervention. And it explains the right to restitution and the availability of and the application process for any witness fee to which a victim is entitled. Here are the crime victims' general rights in Missouri. To be present at all criminal proceedings, even if the victim is called to testify or may be called to testify as a witness in the case. To confer with a prosecutor regarding bail hearings, guilty pleas, pleadings of insanity, hearings, sentencing, and probation revocation hearings. To be present at any hearing in which the defendant is present before a probation and parole hearing, and to full participation in all phases of parole hearings or probation revocation hearings. To be heard at juvenile probation, revocation, and parole hearings initiated by the Board of Probation and Parole, and release proceedings for persons found not guilty by reason of insanity. Victims may offer a written statement, video, or audio tape in lieu of a personal appearance. I didn't know that. Victims are guaranteed to protection from harmful threats from a defendant or persons acting on behalf of defendant for activities arising out of cooperation with law enforcement officials, and the right to a secure waiting area during a court proceeding. You have the right to speedy disposition of cases and speedy appellate review, allowing for the defendant to prepare a defense. You have the right to fair employment rights, including the rights of a victim, witness, or member of a victim's family not to be discharged or disciplined by an employer for honoring a subpoena or for participating in the preparation of a criminal proceeding. Didn't know that either. To regain property from a prosecutor or law enforcement officer once it is no longer needed for evidence or retention during an appeal, unless it is contraband or subject to forfeiture proceedings. And it says in parentheses, within 5 working days upon request. So when you request property back from the prosecutor or law enforcement, they have 5 days to get it to you after you've written a request. To creditor intercession services by the prosecuting attorney if the victim is unable, as a result of the crime, to temporarily meet financial obligations. To limited compensation for out-of-pocket loss and for qualified medical care necessary as a result of the crime. The laws granting rights to crime victims are in the Missouri Constitution, Article 1, Section 32, and in the Missouri Revised Statutes, Chapter 595. Crime victims who want more information regarding their rights may contact their local prosecutors. The pamphlet also lists ways to contact Missouri Victim Assistance Network and the Missouri Department of Public Safety Crime Victim Services Unit. The Crime Victim Services Unit assists crime victims in the event of possible victims' rights violations. So let's say you're not getting an answer from your police officer or from your prosecutor. You should call the Missouri Department of Public Safety Crime Victim Services Unit. Their toll-free number is 866-334-6682. The state of Missouri has a fund to reimburse some crime victims for certain financial losses. You may be eligible for benefits if you're a victim of violent crime and suffered personal bodily injury, you're a relative who requires counseling to better assist a sexual assault victim with recovery, you're a spouse, child, or other dependent of a victim who has died as a direct result of a crime, or you assumed financial obligations incurred as a result of the victim's death, or if you're a Missouri resident who suffered personal injury in a state that does not have a crime victims compensation program, and the injury would be covered if the crime had occurred in Missouri. To be eligible, you must have reported the incident within 48 hours to the proper law enforcement agency or had a good reason for delay. Wow, that's harsh. But wait, there's more. Filed the compensation claim within 2 years of the crime or discovery of the crime, and incurred medical expenses and lost time from work, or incurred no medical bills but lost at least 2 weeks' wages. The rate of compensation is $40 a day or $200 a week. Depending on the case, victims' compensation may be available for medical care, psychiatric treatment, or other counseling, funeral expenses, and wage loss reimbursement for the victim. Total recovery may not exceed $25,000. The pamphlet goes on to explain the court process and how to appeal, what fines are allowed, and prison terms. For example, a Class C felony for first-degree sexual abuse provides for 3 to 10 years with up to a $10,000 fine. I've linked to this brochure at rapethepodcast.com. You're going to hear a conversation I had with Greene County Prosecuting Attorney Dan Patterson about how his office is handling these cases. But first, I talk with a young lady who is smack dab in the middle of this process here in Greene County, Missouri. I'm talking with Cassidy Brown. Do you want to be anonymous, or are you?
No, that's fine.
Are you out in
Yeah, everyone knows. Yeah.
So I saw a post that you put on Facebook. It was forwarded to me by a friend of mine's daughter, and you're still very angry about what happened to you.
Yeah.
So tell us what happened and tell us why you're angry.
2 years ago, I was at a small get together. Wasn't really even a party. It was just like me and I think there were 10 people that I went to high school with, knew well, partied with all the time. I was new to drinking. I was young, I was 19. So I got really drunk and long story short, was passed out, couldn't wake up. And the girl who I had gone to the party with, she was a single mom and never got to be away from her kid. This was her one night out, and she had to get up at 6 a.m. and go get him. So and these were our friends. It wasn't like she left me in a bar or some club or something. We were at a friend's house and she couldn't lift me to get me to the car, and the guys at the party wouldn't help her. She assumed it was because they didn't want to leave their party. She was basically I'm just going to leave her here and you guys can just keep an eye on her, meaning make sure she doesn't throw up and drown or something, make sure she's just good. She left, and one of my friends at the time, someone I thought was my friend, basically just came in the bathroom and had sex with me when I was asleep. I wasn't awake. I was in and out, and I was awake enough. I was mostly just mad because I was I don't want to and you're still trying, but I wasn't in my head thinking oh my God, my friend's raping me. So I wasn't screaming or anything. I just was in shock. And that was just in between falling asleep. I wasn't really awake for most of it. And when I finally did wake up, he was still sitting in there and he had his head down and my clothes were pulled off on the bathroom floor. And I asked him if he had sex with me when I was unconscious, and he wouldn't answer and he wouldn't look at me, and he just sat there. And I started piecing together what had happened. I was covered in puke. That's just the short version. He fled. He ran out the back door and disappeared. He was gone. And
which would indicate that he knew he'd done something terrible.
Yeah. Well, when he was doing it, I started to get scared and I was fighting him, and he was he said, I'm not going to rape you. And I hadn't even said the word rape. It was almost he was trying to talk himself out of what he was doing. He knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt. So that happened. I got away. One of my family members came and picked me up off the side of a road because I was running from the house. It was 4 or 5 in the morning. Sun was just coming up. I had been ovulating at the time of my assault. So my family talked me into getting a rape kit because they knew that they would give me contraceptives and STD prevention. And I didn't even know what a rape kit was, but I did it because my family was telling me that was what I was supposed to do. I got a rape kit. I ended up waiting 4 months before reporting because I was just very emotional, really confused about what was going on. A lot of conflicting feelings. So in 4 months, I reported it, and it took a year for my rape kit to come back, and it matched. The DNA evidence matched him. I had to do a cold call with my detective assigned to my case. And basically I called my perpetrator, and he talked about it to me, like admitted it, apologized for it. It was a 27 minute long phone call. Other witnesses from the party were interviewed by my detective in the investigation process, and they all pretty much ratted him out. 2 girls that I didn't know from that party apparently saw him go in the bathroom, and they asked his friend what he was doing, and his friend said, "Don't worry about it." So I think that his friend knew what he was going to do. I went through all of this, had like literally every piece of evidence you can have. And my detective was really confident that it was going to go to prosecution, because we were like, how could it not? And they dropped it. They dropped my case like a week ago. So
the police dropped your case, or the prosecutors?
The prosecutors dropped my case.
So you had a really supportive police officer, detective, whatever, that was giving you really great feedback and support, you think?
Yeah, there were like a couple things that I felt he could have handled better, just as far as like, I mean, the process took a year, everything takes so long, and that sucked. And I feel like he could have called me and kept me in the loop better. But as far as like the investigation itself and the way he spoke to me when we got the chance to speak, he was very supportive. I felt nothing but like empathy and like kindness from him. He made me feel like I was really thankful for his part in it. He handled it really well. So nothing was wrong with that. It's just, they didn't really give me an explanation. They just were like, we don't have sufficient evidence to convince a jury that the assault took place, is what they said.
How much contact have you had with the prosecuting attorney's office?
I actually have. I've like kept a log of everything in my phone, but over the past, let me just find it. So they contacted me on July 14th. They told me that they would have my case reviewed that week to let me know if they were going to be filing charges. That was July 14th. And then I didn't hear from her till August 12th. And she said that she was still making a decision, because I had asked her, hey, do you have an update for me? Because you said it would be done that week, and it's been a month now. She said she hadn't made a decision yet. And then September 28th was when she told me that the charges were being dropped. So I have only actually spoken to her 3 times. I've never met her before. When she picked up my case, COVID was going on. I moved away. We didn't really have a chance to ever meet. But yeah, we only ever even spoke 3 times. Twice on the phone and 1 through email.
And you don't know why they decided to not go forward?
No, I have no idea. I feel like she just told me there wasn't sufficient evidence, and I could have been like, what do you mean? Like, how, what do you mean? But in that phone call, I was very like flustered and emotional, and I couldn't like think of words. Like
you feel re-traumatized?
Yeah, it was, I just didn't want to stay on the phone. Like, it was a 5-minute phone call, and I was like, you know what? I'll just call back when I want to talk about it. 'Cause I need to like talk to my mom and be with my family. So I just hung up. Yeah. Actually, so that day on September 28th is when I got off the phone, and I'm like thinking it's over, and I made the post about my assault, and I included like details of like the backlash I had received from like friends and friends of friends and people in Springfield who found out about it, and the way they treated me. It was more so like, I wasn't really like expecting it to blow up. I was kind of just like, I wanted people to know, like, this is what you're faced with when you come forward, and this rape culture like lives in us, and we don't even realize it. I was just basically trying to spread awareness, and it ended up blowing up, and people were calling the prosecutor's office, the police department. People were just going crazy, because they were like, how, just like me, they're like, how is that not enough? How can you not prosecute someone off that? After it went viral, semi-viral here, Chief of Police Williams did a live meeting on their Facebook, and people were asking questions, and people just were flooding the comments with like, why did you let Cassidy Brown's case go? Like, what's going on? And I obviously know it's the prosecutors that did it, but I still was like, you know what? Ask.
Yeah.
Bring it up,
Yeah.
So people were bringing it up, and he ended up addressing it in the live call. And he was like, I actually spoke. This was like 2 days after they told me the charges were dropped. He was like, I actually spoke to the prosecutor's office today and convinced them to give it a second review. And he straight up, so he admitted that the reason they were giving it a second review was because Chief of Police Williams was like demanding it, because people were demanding it.
Yeah.
He made it very clear that it was because of the attention it was receiving on social media. And then like a few days after that, Dan Patterson, the head of the prosecutor's office, who is now reviewing my case, called Jordan Harris, who's the president of Me Too Springfield, because he had found out about the protest. He's never called me, but he called her and told her that he will not be swayed by the media and that my case was always going to get a second review. And we were like, no, he's trying to cover his tracks because somebody screwed up and he doesn't want to admit that there was a mistake made in dropping the charges. So he's acting like it was always going to get a second review from the start, which just obviously is not true, because they would have either waited until the second review to tell me the charges were or weren't dropped, or they would have told me, Mel Myers would have told me on the phone, yeah, don't freak out yet because it's getting a second review. Like that's it. He just lied pretty much. So it is getting a second review now. Hopefully it like leads to something.
So you've got a connection. You used to work with Me Too Springfield. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about how you feel like Me Too Springfield is supporting sexual assault victims in the community besides yourself.
Yeah, I worked there for like 6 months, and everybody pretty much on that team is a survivor themselves for the most part. And I feel like they're very motivated to do whatever they can for sexual assault victims. The president actually was advocated for me, and she went with me to report my assault and was there with me through most of the process of that. And they do a lot of they have open sharing spaces for survivors to come and just be around each other and find healing and talking to each other about what they went through. And they have fundraisers. They raise a lot of money just that goes into just so many things for survivors. They rent out buildings for events to get them together and to get people talking. And they try to, everyone there is we've gone through advocacy training and stuff like that so that we can better respond to people who have been through sexual assault. They've done a lot of work with the police department and how they respond to sexual assault calls. They're just really involved in every aspect.
You think they're doing a good job?
I do, yeah. I really, I get flustered when I try to talk about it because they really do so much and they've been really involved. I can't cover it in words, but if it weren't for Me Too Springfield, I think that we would be even more behind here. I think that they're the biggest support for sexual assault victims here. Yeah, I'm really grateful.
I've seen that. And I've been to I went to one of their training sessions they had at the library, which was really interesting. Mm-hmm. And I love the yoga for survivors that they do. I think that's an incredible event that they put on, although I have yet to actually attend it, but I love the idea. So you feel like Springfield has come a long way, possibly, as far as supporting victims. And we still have a lot further to go. But when you were saying when you first walked up today that there had been a protest for you a couple of days ago, and you weren't sure how to process that.
Yeah. It's kind of crazy. Going from, in the beginning, I had 3 friends who had my back and believed me, and my family, obviously. But for the most part, it was relentless bullying and harassment and just hell. I actually was living in hell on earth. My reputation was torn to pieces. Every decision I've ever made in my life was being picked apart. It was really bad. I felt really alone. I had nobody. And then all of a sudden, overnight, somehow I had 2,000 people who were this is super messed up. I was told by multiple people that I didn't need to fight anymore because they were going to fight for me, which was it's been a really big deal. It's really surreal to see that. I couldn't believe like how many people, I feel like I've only ever seen people not care. So to see so many people like care so much was super, it like brought me a lot of peace for sure. I can't even like describe how it felt, but it was a huge deal. I'll like remember it forever, regardless of what happens. It was a really big thing to me.
Yeah. And hopefully you're setting kind of a precedent here for other survivors.
Yeah. I actually said that, like, I was hoping that other people in the protests and people driving by and just people who heard about it could find healing in it. Also just being like, okay, people care about this and people are going to be on my side if I decide that I'm ready to talk and come forward. Like, I think the biggest thing stopping people from speaking out about it, I would say, is probably the backlash that they know they're going to face because they've watched other people face it.
Yeah. Do you have any advice for victims who may want to, of course, it seems like your first instinct is to go to social media and start trash talking the person who did this to you. Is that a good idea?
I'm not going to tell anybody. I'm not going to tell anybody how they should react or feel or respond to an act of violence against them because I know better. But I think it just boils down to you like knowing yourself and like not rushing your process, doing what feels good to you in that moment. Because once somebody takes something like that from you, your responsibility is over. Like, you take no responsibility or ownership of their actions. It's not your job to protect them. It's not your job to avoid trash talking them. I think like whatever is going to bring you peace and closure, whatever helps you, I think that you should do it. Like, obviously, like, I'm not like, go murder people, you know, but there's more than one way to be a survivor. And it's not exclusive to people who speak out and people who advocate and people who forgive and move on and are happy in their lives. Like, you can be just as much of a survivor of violence when you don't talk about it. Like, as long as you deal with it some way. Yeah. You know you and you know what works for you. So I don't want to tell anybody how to process that.
That's smart. Is there anything else that you would like to add, say?
I don't think so.
I'm so proud of you for coming this far, and just thank you so much for sharing your story. And I think that whatever the rest of your life is going to be like is probably going to be influenced by this situation. It's going to make you help a lot of people.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope that.
Does it make you feel better to help others, to know that you're helping others?
Oh, yeah. That's like one of the biggest parts of my healing personally has been like, especially in the last week. It happened when I worked for Me Too Springfield, but specifically in the last week or so since my post blew up, I've had thousands of people messaging me and just telling me like how they are unable to speak up and how they are finding healing in me bringing this to the forefront. That is a huge, huge thing to me. It means a lot to me. And that's definitely like the most comforting thing to me in all of this is just knowing that I'm helping, even if it's one person. Like, that's important.
Awesome. Now that I'm leaking. That was beautiful. Okay. Well, thank you. I spoke with Greene County Prosecuting Attorney Dan Patterson almost a year ago, pre-COVID, and he was just really a nice guy.
So originally, when I went to law school, I had anticipated going straight on active duty as a judge advocate. But then due to the drawdown in the 90s, I went to work for a firm in St. Louis for almost 2 years. Always wanted to had an interest in prosecution, come from a public service background, probably based on the influence of my parents, scouting, work in the Army, those sorts of things, and decided that work wasn't for me in that kind of firm, and was able to move back home to Springfield and eventually get on with a prosecutor's office after Judge Mountjoy was appointed to the bench and there were some openings, and now Judge Ron Carrier hired me. My wife was working in the prosecutor's office at the time. She wasn't my wife then, but she was working in the office. And Judge Carrier, who was prosecutor, asked me about working on these kinds of cases. And so I started working on actually child abuse and child sex cases. At the time, it was just Jill and I who worked on those cases. And then eventually I continued to work in what became the persons unit under Darrell Moore when he was prosecutor before I moved on to the major crimes unit. So I grew up in the prosecutor's office.
It sounds like you worked a lot in the sexual assault part of it.
I did. Most of our cases, it's true today, most of our sexual assault cases involve children. We do have a number of adult sexual assault cases, but I primarily worked in the area of child sexual abuse and child abuse and did that for a number of years. I've been here 24 years now.
Can you just give a general percentage of the rates that are reported in Greene County that might end up in a conviction?
We don't track cases that way because not all cases are referred to us. Like it says on Law and Order, the police investigate crimes and prosecutors prosecute the offenders. And so cases are submitted to us once law enforcement believes there's probable cause that a crime has been committed and probable cause to believe a certain person committed that crime. Now, we work with the police. They don't report to us. We don't direct them, but we have a great working relationship with our law enforcement agencies. And so they do consult us during investigations, but we don't have a statistician. And so we don't track the number of cases that are reported versus the cases we handle. In fact, in all cases, we don't really keep a conviction rate because that's not what our job is about. Our job is not solely about obtaining convictions. It's about pursuing the cases that we can, doing the right thing, and seeking justice. And that means sometimes you file cases that you don't obtain convictions in.
That's interesting that you don't track that. That kind of blows my mind, to be honest with you. I thought that would give you some kind of way of knowing whether what you're doing was, I don't want to say successful or not, because I don't know. How do you track your progress?
We track our progress based on each individual case. Each individual case is unique, has a unique defendant, a unique victim, a unique set of facts, and so you can't really compare one case to another. What we have to try to do is do the best job in each individual case that we can based on all those unique features.
Can you explain a little bit about what declining to prosecute a case is about? What are the definitions for that?
There's not really a definition. Our charging standard is we look to charge a case where ethically we can have a reasonable probability of conviction by pursuing the case. And so what that means is we have to look at the evidence, and we can only make a filing decision based on admissible evidence and evidence that would be sufficient to be able to obtain a conviction.
Okay. That would lead to my question, what is admissible evidence if someone feels that they've been raped and they want to know if what's happened around them, if there's any admissible evidence?
Lots of things can be admissible evidence, and no two cases have the same kind of evidence. And so there's not like a recipe that says if you have X, Y, and Z, you have a submissible case. Instead, you have to look at what you have and determine whether that piece of evidence is admissible and what it aids you in proving or corroborating. The most basic form of evidence is the witness's testimony, someone who says, hey, I saw this, or this happened to me. What I perceived, what I saw, what I heard, what I said, what the person said to me, what they did. The testimony is the most basic form of evidence. And from there, just like in any case, you look for evidence that will corroborate the account of the victim to allow us to prove the case. And so that's very wide-ranging. It could be In certain circumstances, it could be the 911 call, things that are in it. It could be other witnesses, both prior to, during, which is rare in a sex offense, or after. It could be evidence that we collect from a crime scene. And by a crime scene, that's more than just a place. That could also be a vehicle. That could be a person's body, both a suspect's body or a victim's body. There's lots of things you might consider a scene from which you might collect physical evidence. Is there physical evidence? That could be injuries. It could be things about the crime scene. It could be alcohol. It could be drugs. It could be lots of different things. You might have surveillance at different places where the individuals were prior to or after whatever happened. An exploding field is digital evidence, which could be everything from what's on a cell phone to what's on a social media platform, those kinds of things. So it's a really long answer, and I could go on. It's just there are a number of things you want to look at.
How important is the rape kit?
So it's important. It's a tool, right? I think that perhaps we think of it as being this be-all, end-all, which it's not. It is a tool just like everything else. There's the potential DNA collection. There's the interview, the medical history that's taken as part of that. All of those things are important. How important it is depends on what is collected, what is found, what kind of case it is. In a stranger attack case, which are rare but do occur, it's a much more important piece of evidence if you obtain DNA, because it helps you identify the offender. In many sexual assault cases, the offender is typically known to the victim. And so who the person is often not as important in those cases. It doesn't mean it's not important. It's just that it really depends on what all the other facts of the case are. Just like any piece of evidence, it depends on how it fits with the other pieces of the puzzle.
What can victims do to help you get the best evidence?
The absolute best thing that can be done, which is not always feasible, especially when you think about the trauma of these experiences. And so you want to be careful about saying what the best thing is, because you don't want to blame folks, right, who haven't perhaps done what you would like to see in an ideal situation. So the first thing you would want to say, right, is you want to prevent the crime in the first place. You want to think about your own personal safety when you go out, and you want to think about the personal safety of your friends and acquaintances when you're out with them in terms of not engaging in behavior that might make you a target or a more vulnerable person. Oftentimes, intoxication is something that these offenders look for and use as a way to make victims more vulnerable. So in a perfect world, we think about those things on the front side, right, to try to prevent these things from happening at all. In the event it does, the quickest, the soonest a person makes a report, preserves evidence, right? If, depending on the nature of the assault, going to the hospital, having the sexual assault forensic examination, what we call a rape kit, performed, all those things to preserve evidence at the soonest, as in, and it's not unique to sexual assault cases, but delay in reporting, delay in investigation is never the friend of a criminal investigation.
If it happened a long time ago, are those cases even possible to prosecute?
They certainly are. They are certainly more difficult, right? Because evidence you might have been able to obtain if it was reported the day it happened could be gone. And there's different kinds of delays. Say, for example, the individuals went to a commercial establishment, some kind of business, right? Whether that's a convenience store, a bar, or whatever, that might have surveillance video that might help us corroborate things. You know, most places don't store that indefinitely. It's recorded over after about, depending on the establishment, a couple weeks, 30 days, those kinds of things. So some evidence, right, or like the evidence you might get from a sexual assault forensic examination is very fleeting. You have a limited window in which to obtain those things. If you don't, you have to look for other ways to corroborate cases. So, for example, and I'm sorry, I forget the name of the defendant, but we had a sexual assault case where our victim went to work. It happened when she was in high school. I believe it was either middle school or high school. I believe it's high school. So she goes to college, right? Goes away. She goes to work for a federal agency. And at some point, she decides, based on her training and experience, that she should make a report of the sexual abuse she suffered at the hand of this coach. Her report was actually taken not here, but where she lives. That gets forwarded to the Springfield Police Department, who work on the case. And in that case, they performed what's called a cold call, where the victim called the offender all these years later and discussed what happened. And what made that case prosecutable was the fact that he made admissions on that recorded phone call. So it is not impossible to prosecute very old cases, but it is certainly difficult. And I could not say it would be likely. That does not mean it wouldn't be investigated and an attempt made, but it just depends on what evidence is available.
Are there false rape claims, and how do you judge the credibility of the victim?
Yeah, there are. There's a very high profile one from our own jurisdiction where we obtained a conviction. This is years ago. We learned later, during the sentencing process, that there was some issue with the DNA collected in that case. And so during what's called the motion for new trial, which is in between the jury verdict and the judge conducting the sentencing, based on that information, we actually dismissed that case. And then a few years later, I don't remember how long it was, that person who was the reported victim in that case admitted that it wasn't true. Now, that's a very rare thing. I think it's been a while since I've looked at the FBI statistics, and they have tried to quantify that. As I recall, that number is somewhere between 4 and 7%, but that might not be today's number. But at any rate, it's a low number.
Would you say there's a common misconception that it's a high number?
I guess I would say that depends on who you talk to. There might be some people who have that belief. I think more common than believing there are false reports are perhaps the unfortunate victim blaming that goes on, or judgment that says, I would have never put myself in that position, so don't you bear some of the responsibility for doing it? I think that perception really poses a bigger problem for us in terms of presenting cases to juries, those kinds of things. But certainly there are some people that hold that view, that percentage is higher. And that's one of the things that we have to continually work on, both in our community in terms of knowledge and prevent and those sorts of things, so that we support victims to combat both of those misconceptions.
What kind of trauma-informed training does your staff receive in dealing with victims?
So it's something we talk about a lot, and probably before, I don't know exactly when trauma-informed training became the name. You know, currently it's something on the forefront of what we talk about, because we know a lot more about how the brain operates, right, when someone experiences a traumatic event. And so that informs our approaches. Before we knew those things, I think we used to think of it as just providing empathetic service to those that we serve. Since we've learned more about that, so we have from time to time had prosecutors receive the Russell Strand training on the forensic experiential interview technique, which really focuses a lot on understanding how the brain focuses after a traumatic event. And so that informs us in some ways. Also through community partnership of the Ozarks. It's been a few years now, I think, since the CPO got a grant where we trained trainers in our community to have them conduct further trainings. So, for example, Julie Watson, who is our victim witness coordinator, took that training, has provided trainings for our office, not just of attorneys, but of support staff as well. And then we also partner with organizations like our local Rape Crisis Center, the Victim Center. And so Randy Bartell, the executive director, has also provided us training. We've done some training for court personnel as well. And so it's an ongoing thing.
The CNN article was the catalyst for me doing this podcast, because I didn't know what horrible scenarios could have happened at one time to victims as far as getting justice because of various mistakes made by people. And so, where was I going with that? I wanted to know, has that article, because it was shocking to me, but I was very thrilled to find out that there was a sexual assault task force that had been created as a result of that. And I wonder if you could maybe tell me if there's been any difference in the way your office is operating as a result of that. I know you guys weren't actually task force.
Not really as a result of that. The CNN article was helpful in some ways. It was in many ways based on outdated information and unfair reviews of some cases. One of the things we constantly have to look at is building our institutional capacity, which is something that we, not just the prosecutor's office, but our local law enforcement partners, it's something that we're continually in the process of doing. And so there are lots of things that we were doing before that story, before the task force, during it, and after. And just some examples of that are, I think we passed the local law enforcement sales tax 2. If my memory serves me, that's 2009, but I might have that date wrong. At that time, we were able to double the number of victim witness advocates we have in our office from 2 to 4. Since that time, the Missouri Association of Prosecuting Attorneys obtained a Victims of Crime Act grant to put victim advocates in all circuits across the state. And as part of that, initially we got one additional advocate and then added another. And we continue to look at ways of increasing that capacity. For example, our advocates have more victims they serve, and I'm talking about all kinds of victims, right, from if your car is stolen to whatever. But the last time I got a number from the grant folks who track those things, we had about 700 victims each of them were working with at any given time. In addition, the persons unit, I mentioned earlier that before we had units, so we had unofficial units, Jill and I prosecuted those cases, and we have both as chief assistant and then as the elected prosecutor, I have worked to increase the capacity of that unit. The persons unit handles domestic violence cases, crimes against children, and sex offenses. And so, fortunately, thanks to the voters in 2017 passing the general revenue sales tax in Greene County, we doubled that unit size, or nearly, from 5 to 9 prosecutors. Other things that we've been working on are implementing the trauma-informed training with CPO. In 2016, I helped the police department fund what are called soft interview rooms. So we have one both at the police department headquarters here off Chestnut Expressway and one at the South District Station. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with those, but we funded the furnishings and they funded the cameras that go in there that basically looks like a living room, as opposed to having a victim of a person's crime and in a cold, hard interview room. It's like just a plastic chair and the desk, like where you might interview a suspect. Instead, it's a room much more conducive to conducting a trauma-informed interview of that person. I don't think that the CNN article was interesting. It maybe focused us more. But I think what the task force found as they looked at these matters, and I think our community knows, is that all along this time, we have constantly been working to improve our response to victims and continue to do so.
Are there any laws that you would change or make to help you along the way to make the job easier for prosecuting rapists?
I wouldn't say to make the job easier. I think there are ways we could make it better. And I think there are ways we could make it better for victims. So in the criminal process, when we file a felony charge against someone, after they're arrested on the arrest warrant or come in on the summons that's issued to court, after their first appearance, one of the things you're supposed to do quickly is have what's called the preliminary hearing. And the purpose of the preliminary hearing is to put a check on the power of the prosecutor by ensuring that we have some evidence. We have evidence to show there's probable cause a crime was committed. And if we show that, we meet that fairly low burden, then the case is what's called bound over for trial. And it goes to the circuit court side and the case then actually proceeds from there. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
So when you look at the U.S. Constitution, we come from a grand jury-based system, which is helpful when you have 12 citizens who look at it. The grand jury takes the place of a preliminary hearing in the federal system. And the grand jury is secret for important reasons. It protects people who might be accused, but where there's not sufficient evidence to go forward. It also protects victims. And one of the ways it does that is in a grand jury proceeding, hearsay evidence is admissible. And so many times you can have the detective come in and perhaps play the recording of the interview with the victim that you might have done in a soft interview room, or talk about it, or play the interview of the suspect, or show the grand jury these other items of evidence to meet that probable cause standard to show, yes, there is evidence to believe a crime was committed and this person did it, and this case should go on to the circuit court. If we change the rules with regard to preliminary hearings such that they could be conducted like grand jury proceedings, then victims would not have to appear in court as many times as they do today. One of the most daunting things for a victim is to go through our criminal justice system. We have the best criminal justice system in the world, but because of the way it works and that it's an evidence-based system and we have the right to confrontation at trial, it's very hard. Victims, at a minimum, when they testify, have to revisit in their minds what happened to them. In addition, as I'm sure, the tactic in a sexual assault case is typically not to attack the investigation or the police, but to attack the victim. And there is only so much we can do through objections to curtail that. So the long answer of saying is our preliminary hearing system were set up like the grand jury system so that a victim would not necessarily have to testify at a preliminary hearing, that we could meet our burden of probable cause and we could treat the victims in a more trauma-informed way. Now, if we had a trial, if it went to trial, right, the victim would still obviously have to testify because under our Constitution, at trial, we have the right to confront our accusers. But that's one way we can make the criminal justice system both quicker and also better in terms of the way we treat victims while still holding us, the state, to the burden we should be held to.
So what can I do to help you get that done or help make that change?
That's a good question. It's something that we on a state level talk about from time to time in terms of the legislature and changes to criminal procedure. I can't tell you off the top of my head what you as an individual could do now, but those are the kinds of things we could work towards. Others are, I think in a community of our size, we should have a standing grand jury sit for 6 months basically, and then you pick a new one. We couldn't do that right now in these times of limited gatherings, but I hope to ask the presiding judge to seat a grand jury once we are past this. I've asked prior. We don't get them very often in Greene County, but they are a particularly useful tool in child abuse cases and sexual assault cases as well.
I bet, yeah. What kind of punishments are in store for rapists?
It's hard to respond to that because the question is very general. And so what I would say is I think you should do prison time if you commit a rape. What we have to recognize is that there's not like just one charge called rape. Sexual assault have a number of different charges with which you might charge someone based upon their conduct. So, for example, rape in the first degree is what used to be called forcible rape. And commonly, that's what it is. Rape in the second degree used to be called sexual assault, and that is now called rape in the second degree. We have sexual misconduct charges, sexual abuse charges. There are a number of different charges. And, the punishment has to fit both the crime and the defendant. So you have to look at the seriousness of the offense, what happened when it was being committed, and then you also, what were the consequences to the victim of that. I don't think people realize how long this kind of violation can stay with a person and affect them. And not just forcible rape. That's the danger of just saying rape, because when you say rape, everyone pictures the forcible rape, right? The guy with the knife or the gun or jumps out of the bushes. And that's really not what we're talking about most of the time. Most of the time, what we're talking about are rape in the second degree, sexual intercourse, or deviant sexual intercourse without consent. And those offenses that don't involve that force also are very traumatic and affected. So you have to take that into account. And then you got to look at the history of the defendant. What's their criminal history? What is perhaps their history of similar conduct that's either been charged or uncharged? All those sorts of things. And so beyond saying that it is these are serious crimes and that there should be serious consequences, I can't say this should be the punishment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no two rapes are the same. So that would be hard to generalize for sure. But do you think that the sentences are tough enough in our community?
I would say it depends. There are sentences that I wish were different. And part of that involves, I think, education and dealing with those misconceptions of victim blaming, which sometimes I think enter into, if even subconsciously, into sentencing, whether it be by a jury or a judge. And so we have had sentences that are excellent, and we've had some that we're disappointed in. We also have had cases where we believe there was sufficient evidence at a probable cause hearing where judges didn't find probable cause. And I talked earlier about how we don't track convictions. We don't use that always as our measure of success. We have to keep fighting the fight, charging the cases where we can, because by charging cases, taking them to trial, we educate the public. Some of it a little at a time, right? So if we have 12 to 14 jurors in a jury box, that small group of our community is being educated. A somewhat larger group that came to jury selection gets some education through jury selection. And then the public at large, through media coverage of the trials and work we do, also gets some education. And so that's one way the criminal justice system, I think, can help us change cultural norms and how we approach and think about these cases in support of victims in the community outside of the criminal justice system.
What do you think about the attitudes towards rape changing as a result of the Me Too culture? Has there been a shift somewhere that you can pinpoint?
You know, certainly. I don't think I could say I could pinpoint it. I think we have seen a change that was moving prior to, and I don't know when we would actually define the start of the Me Too movement, but I think we see changes and advances in both law enforcement's approach, prosecution approach, as well as community approach to these things prior to that, and certainly became more focused, right, after the start of the Me Too movement. I think we've seen continued advancement. For example, one thing that, was going around across the country is originally family justice centers. Ours were started out in San Diego, and originally the focus was on domestic violence. We have a lot of crossover of domestic violence and sexual assault. And so as these centers grow and as ours grow, you end up serving more than just domestic violence victims, but also sexual assault victims and others. And that's a long answer to your question. I think that we have seen continual advancement that certainly was sped up by the Me Too movement.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a lot of people who would like to speed it up even more. And so that's why one of the reasons I'd like to do this podcast is I want victims or family members and friends of victims to know that there are changes that have been made so they don't have to be deterred from wanting to proceed through the justice system, that there have been advances made and they could get a good outcome. Would you agree with that?
I would also say that one of the things to consider is that pursuing a case through the criminal justice system is not always the right answer for every victim. Sometimes even in cases where we do have sufficient evidence to go forward. Unlike other cases, this is an area, because the attacks that occur on victims, the very personal nature of the crime and trauma inflicted, There are some victims who perhaps it is not healthy to go through that process. And then there are others who make a personal decision that they don't want to. Now, that said, I still think it's important to make that report and to preserve evidence early. But one of the things we do when we work with victims is even when we review a case, if it is prosecutable, but the victim tells us they cannot or will not or don't want to go through with those proceedings, we won't. We honor that. That's one of the things I know that the victim center advocates who respond to hospitals try to inform victims about so that they will allow the collection of evidence because it preserves your right or at least opportunities as a victim. You might have evidence collected and say, no, I don't want to make a report at this time. But that gives you options later if you change your mind after perhaps the immediate trauma of the event has passed. And I think we need to keep that in mind too as we think about serving victims is I think we want to encourage more reporting and encourage options and ensure we treat those victims in a trauma-informed way. Certainly more reporting is better. I'm a prosecutor. What I want to do is hold people accountable for their actions, especially in these kinds and other violent crimes. But I also have to recognize that in these kinds of cases, we need to keep that victim's wishes in mind as well.
In the next episode,
what does trauma-informed mean?
Trauma-informed is a technical term that should be used to describe a system or an organization sometimes that is informed on how trauma impacts individuals. And every aspect of policies to decisions to the paint color on the wall or to how an environment is set up should center around that understanding of trauma. And so it informs everything you do.
Survivors in Springfield are one step closer to justice.
As labs work through a backlog of rape investigation kits, DNA matches could help authorities solve crime. What does this mean for assault victims in Springfield?
Help for victims and help for families and friends of victims is available at rain.org, or you can call them at 1-800-656-HOPE. Please visit Rape the Podcast to find out how you can support this podcast. Review and rate Rape the Podcast wherever you're listening right now. Thank you for joining me. I'm Julie Ballou, and this is Rape the Podcast.